Welcome to EWTN Live. I'm Father Mitch Pacwa, and it's our chance to bring you guests around the world. We'll be talking, in fact, with a filmmaker who goes around the world, Jim Kelty. He's made lots of excellent films and done these for EWTN about various saints, heroes of the faith. He's got another interesting story to share tonight about evangelization on the American frontier. It's really wonderfully done. So before we get to that, just want to talk briefly with our Vice President here at EWTN for Programming and Promotions, Mr. Peter Gagnon. Peter, how you doing? Good to see you.
Programming and
what
Production.
You got? That's what I said.
So this week, actually next month, we have a couple of really big events coming up. We have the Synod on the Pan-Amazonian region.
Yes.
And EWTN is going to be there with kind of daily updates on our news, but we're also going to do a special the week of October 6th with Brian Patrick, Father Raymond D'Souza, and Matthew Bunton. We're going to be there in Rome and kind of laying out what the Synod is bringing. We are going to do the opening Mass for the Synod and the closing Mass. And in the past, we've done multiple episodes of coverage, but we're going to have one special and then updates that we're going to put on social media and in our news program. So that's one big event that's happening.
Cool.
Secondly is the canonization of Henry Cardinal Newman. And so we want to, we're going to do live coverage of the canonization, but we also have specials airing throughout the lead up to the canonization. They'll begin the week of October 6th that our Great Britain office has been producing. So we'll take, I think, a quick look at one of the clips from one of those specials.
Yeah, we have it ready. Let's take a look at that.
In a quiet corner of Littlemore, Oxford, a devoted scholar risked everything, seeking truth.
He began to see that Anglicanism was a local manifestation of Christianity that was not in communion with the rest of the church.
A Catholic convert on the road to sainthood.
Newman is a kindly light who leads us to the truth of Christ, that guiding principle that we must follow the truth, we must seek the truth out.
A font of wisdom who embodied the balance of faith and reason.
He believes in a religion that is a religion of truth, not opinion, but a religion that has to appeal not only to the head, but to the heart.
It's very exciting. Hopefully folks will not only enjoy the canonization and the specials, but we'll start reading more of Cardinal Newman, soon to be Saint Newman, because the impact that he's had on the 20th century in the church is just phenomenal. So,
and we do have to note that there are going to be 4 others canonized with him. And so we are going to do a special the day before the canonization, talking about Cardinal Newman, but also about those others who are going to be canonized.
Okay,
so, and then we'll do a massive Thanksgiving. So people should go to our website, ewtn.com/Newman, and they can get a list of all the special programs we're having that time.
Peter, thank you very much.
All right, thank you for having me.
We'll be back in just a couple minutes with tonight's guest, so please stay with us. Thank you. Welcome back. Our guest tonight is a very talented filmmaker. He goes around the world filming. And you might have seen some of the projects on our network. Movie Kateri about St. Kateri Tekakwitha, and also the film Sarah, Ever Forward, Never Back, wonderful presentation of the ministry of St. Junipero Serra. And now his most recent film for EWTN won a Gabriel Award last year from the American Press Association for Best Religious TV Program for national release. It was entitled Called and Chosen, about Navy Chaplain and Medal of Honor recipient Father Vincent Capodanno, who shot 27 times during the Vietnam conflict while ministering to wounded Marines. And his cause for canonization is now being considered. Our guest's newest film is going to premiere later tonight on EWTN at 10 p.m. Eastern Time. So adapt that to your own time zone. It will be called Faith on the Frontier. So please welcome Mr. James Kelty. James, fine. Good to have you back here in Sweet Home, Alabama.
Yeah, good to be here.
Great to do. And also with this film, I have to say, I enjoyed it very much. The photography is beautiful, really is.
Thank you.
And the story is important. A number of your films deal with themes about the relationship of people in the church and the native communities, native peoples that were here. This is an important story, along with, understanding the rest of the history of the various peoples who lived here before the coming of Europeans and Africans. And this is another period of history. Kateri Tekakwitha is, a couple hundred years before these missionaries.
Yeah, 1600s.
Yeah. So tell us a little bit about who you chose and why you chose these three missionaries.
Okay. Well, it's interesting you mentioned, yes, there's the interface between two cultures. You have in Faith on the Frontier, we're talking about 19th century America, settlers moving into Indian land, and the inevitable conflict that arose. I like to look at the individuals who were kind of in the interstitial place between those and trying to mitigate and to accommodate between the two. And that's where these missionaries inevitably were. I mean, if you think about it, the settlers were coming for legitimate reasons. They wanted a new life, The Indians were already there, and they had a life. And so, but the missionary was not coming to get land or resources or to control anything. He or she, many times females were working missionary lands as well.
Yeah.
They were coming to bring the faith to people. At the same time, they were worried about their temporal welfare as well as their spiritual welfare. And the Indians recognized that. The Indians recognized these missionaries were separate. They were a separate breed. And that, I think, is why I'm attracted to them. Father Cerro did that. Kateri and the missionaries who converted her did that. These three that we're going to talk about a bit tonight did that. And I think it's an important place to be.
And sometimes people will say, well, the missionaries only came as tools of empire. Yeah. And that's not the case with these. There might have been people who were working with the government in the United States or the Great Britain and other empires and such, the French. But these three that you talk about were not agents of the government.
No.
Of any government. They love Christ and they loved the Native Americans.
Yes,
I mean, they're living out the two commandments to love God with your whole heart, mind, and soul, and your neighbor as yourself.
Yeah, I suppose if we start to talk about them individually here so the audience knows who we should identify them.
Yes.
Well, the first of the three was a Belgian-born Jesuit, like you, Father Jean-Pierre de Smet. He was Belgian. He came to the United States, which in 1823, to St. Louis in the company of about 10 other Jesuit missionaries, okay? So he was the first one that we talked about. The second one was a Dominican from Italy by the name of Father Samuel Mazzucchelli. He was not ordained when he arrived in the United States. He was ordained in Cincinnati. He arrived in Cincinnati in 1828, just about the same time. De Smet arrived in 23 in St. Louis. Mazzucchelli arrives in Cincinnati, which was an enormous diocese, by the way. I don't know if you know this, the Diocese of Cincinnati extended, I think, as far west as St. Louis and all the way up to the Canadian border. It was immense. And there weren't any priests in it.
No.
None. So he came over in 1828 and landed in Cincinnati. And then our third one is a little later. Father Francis Kraft was a diocesan priest born in New York. And I hope we have some time to talk about him, a very colorful character who had a rich and interesting life. They all did, but Kraft was the one that kind of stuck out. And as you said, none of them were agents for any government. If we go back to,
Yeah, I was going to say that, in fact, when the government sometimes tried to send missionaries under government auspices, the Native American peoples sent them back and said, no, we want the black robes.
Well, that's right. There was, I think, a preference among the Native Americans for Catholic priests. There's a story, for example, of a clan in the Dakota Territory. Spotted Tail was the chief of a tribe at an agency. What they called an agency was a reservation. We're a little later in time now. But Spotted Tail accepted the fact that the Western civilization, white civilization, was there to stay, and he needed to accommodate. He knew his people needed to learn what these people had to offer, and they wanted to start with language. And he noted that in the Episcopalian-run Rosebud Agency in the Dakota Territory, he didn't see too much progress. And so he formed his own delegation and actually went to Washington and petitioned the government to send what they called black robes, which were Catholic priests. That name comes from back during the time when the Jesuits entered the St. Lawrence Valley in the 1600s.
Right.
They were called black robes. And so that name kind of stuck. Any Catholic missionary was then called a black robe, even if he wasn't a Jesuit. But they wanted black robes. They wanted Catholic priests.
Right.
Why? Well, I guess history just speaks for itself. They did a better job. They were more selfless, more dedicated, they were celibate. So they didn't have a family. They weren't occupying land as the non-celibate Protestant missionaries would normally. More like a settler.
They would need a house.
A house, family, kids,
right.
The whole thing.
Some land to feed their families.
And so the autonomous, independent Catholic missionary priest, a celibate priest, was a special breed for them. And they recognized that something there that they wanted, I think.
And that's, so these missionaries, as a matter of fact, with Father de Smet, it was a delegation of Native Americans that came to St. Louis asking for, even before the government was involved, they just were asking for a black robe to come.
Yeah, we tell the story, so I won't go into it too much here, but the Salish people of the Montana-Idaho region, way far west, okay? They're called Salish and sometimes called Flathead. They had heard of the work of the black robes in the St. Lawrence Valley because the Indians who piloted the canoes, and they were expert canoeists, in the fur trade, would go as far west as these Flathead regions and sometimes settle there and talk about the work that the black robes had done in their native land of the St. Lawrence Valley. And so they wanted black robes. So they made 4 attempts to get them, and the nearest ones were in St. Louis, which is where Father Smet had landed.
Right.
And that was the nearest place. They made 4 attempts. Finally, on their 4th attempt, they made contact with the bishop there, and Father de Smet had his job cut out for him. He was going to go. They were going to take him back, and he went.
Yep. And it's one of the qualities you bring out, and certainly was part of my training as a young Jesuit, is that it's very important to adapt to the local culture.
Yeah.
You know, we have a long tradition of doing that in East Asia and Southern Asia and here in the Americas. And usually Jesuits were the first ones to write a dictionary of the Native American languages, grammar. And the locals would not even think of grammar writing. That's just they just speak it.
Right.
But the Jesuits would figure out the grammatical structures and patterns for languages that are totally unrelated to anything they learned in Europe.
Right.
There's no connection.
Yeah.
But they figured these things out and are still a great source. You know, with the things they wrote, and even in the 1600s, are still a source for understanding Native American society and culture, because they were careful observers, so they could learn the culture and adapt.
They adopted the dress, they adopted the language, they accommodated Catholicism, or they accommodated Indian, Native American tradition and cultural ways as far as they could. They did draw a line.
Sure.
Polygamy, gambling, there were things that they pointed out that could not be, were not compatible with Catholicism.
Right.
And they pointed that out. But for the most part, they adopted or adapted the Indian ways to Catholicism and vice versa. It's a marvelous history. Yeah.
Not unlike St. Boniface adapting elements of the Germanic tribes.
Okay.
And we still use Christmas trees. Let's take a look at a clip about Father de Smet.
The year was 1851. Jesuit de Smet was by now somewhat of a legend. With as many miles on him as any mountain fur trapper, de Smet had still lost none of his enthusiasm for evangelizing the tribes of North America, several of whose languages he spoke fluently, and whose lands he'd mapped in detail. Just now, his particular set of skills was of interest to the U.S. government, which was planning an important parley with the tribes west of the Mississippi, to be held at Fort Laramie, Wyoming.
So in order to be involved, as the government had requested, in the 1851 Fort Laramie Treaty, de Smet had to really undertake an odyssey. It began with a long steamboat journey way up the Missouri River, all the way up to Fort Union. And along the way, he would pick up some of these Missouri River tribes that were largely sedentary agricultural societies, such as the Mandan and the Arikara. They wouldn't have gone to the Fort Laramie Treaty by themselves.
And when they went to they took a role in trying to bring peace among the tribes.
Yeah,
there were a lot of intertribal wars.
That was a big part of it. The government, well, we said these men weren't agents of the government. The government went to de Smet and said they knew of his reputation with the Indians. It was flawless. And so they said, can you help us? Of course, he'd mapped the territories. He knew where the boundaries between the different tribes were. Nobody else did. Yeah. We don't know how he figured it out, I guess just by his travels.
Sure.
But he had a map, so he knew where their boundaries were. That was one of the things the government wanted to do, was to try to get the Indians to stop fighting each other. And the growing traffic west, wagon trains of settlers, they wanted to stop the Indian depredations against them. So they had they had a meeting at Fort Laramie in 1851. That was the first of the two meetings they had there. And it was not really very successful because they couldn't really establish the boundaries well enough to, the Indians would agree to things and then, people break agreements and so it didn't.
Well, that hasn't changed.
I can't change the tale, it was, it's grim.
Yeah.
But I would like to talk about the man who tried to do something about it.
One of the other things is you mentioned their primary concern. They're willing to help, bring peace where they could, but their primary goal was to evangelize. And the idea of having a catechism book just did not make sense.
No.
Books were not at all part of Native American culture. So they came up with what they call ladders. What are these ladders?
It's called a little ladder because it's a top to bottom visual display. It's basically an illustrated Bible.
Yeah.
They started with creation and drew pictures of what the Garden of Eden looked like and Adam and Eve, the fall of Adam and Eve, and then they went on up from there, Sodom and Gomorrah and the Old Testament stories on a kind of a rising scale. And this thing was drawn out on a scroll that might be 15 feet long. We show them in the film.
Yeah, let's take a look at it. We got a clip on that ladder catechism, so let's take a look at it.
What we have here is a later published version of the original Catholic ladder that was created by Father Blanchette in Oregon, and he discovered that he was unable to preach effectively through the use of interpreters. And with necessity being the mother of invention and totem poles all around them, he took the inspiration from the totem poles of telling your story from the bottom to the top, or from the earth to the sky, or heaven, which is the ultimate reward for all Christians.
In detail and artistic quality, amazing for their time period, the ladders visually told the Catholic story from creation to the fall of Adam and Eve to Christ's resurrection and ascension to heaven.
So, and that's, again, adapting to the way folks think. Instead of saying, well, you can't learn the faith unless you learn how to use a book. No, they used the mentality visually that worked, and these things were very effective.
They became very elaborate. They were in color. I was astounded when I visited the archive at Marquette, where they have these, at how much detail there was and how, for the time, the production value is amazing. They're falling apart, so they're not going to leave there.
Look, after a couple hundred years, so will we.
Yeah.
So it's expected.
Yeah, very, very effective tool. A ladder.
But so they did. Now we talked a little bit about Father de Smet.
Okay.
The Dominican was
Father
not
Mazzucchelli.
that far west. Where did
Father
he go?
Samuel Mazzucchelli. So he left. He was born in Milan. In the shadow of the famous cathedral over there, the Duomo. Many of you know that famous cathedral. He was
first
born very, very near it, and to a fairly well-to-do family, merchant family. There's no Italy yet. Milan is just a principality. Italy hasn't been organized into a state yet, but he's called an Italian. So he was drawn to the Dominican order. They were in a terrible shape following the French Revolution. Napoleon was very anti-clerical. The whole French Revolution was very anti-clerical, and all the orders were suffering. The Dominicans were reduced to practically nothing, but for some reason he was drawn to them, and he went into the Dominican order as a novice, and he heard an appeal by a Bishop Fenwick of the Cincinnati Diocese, who was over in Rome appealing for missionaries, and he had his order. He appealed. He said, "I want to go." They sent him. He didn't speak a word of English, didn't have very much money. He landed up on the East Coast off a ship, and got on a stagecoach and steamboat and one thing or another. Finally, he's in Cincinnati, and they said he studied there for the priesthood under Bishop Fenwick for 2 years. He was ordained, I think, in 1830, and sent to the Upper Peninsula of Michigan to the Ojibwe people to fill in the void that had been left by the Jesuits, who were run out of there as you know, suppressed in 1767 all over the world. So from 1767 up until about 1830, there were no missionaries in that territory at all. And here comes Mazzucchelli, finally, to replace them. They thought he was a Jesuit.
Yeah.
The Indians did, and I don't know. He might have let them think that for a while.
Yeah.
Because they had a pretty good reputation.
Yeah, he could pass.
Yeah.
But it's
So.
but yeah, there was all the Bourbon kings of France, Spain, and Portugal came out, and had left this vacuum. So he goes up there, and he also experienced some good success based on what the earlier missionaries had done.
He built on that. He made canoe trips to villages to teach and proselytize. I don't know if he had Catholic ladders. I don't know how he did it, but he had a great impact. There were also American settlers filling into that area, and he got into some polemics with the Protestant missionaries up there. He actually got into a series of debates with a Protestant missionary. Well,
let's take a look at the clip about Father Mazzucchelli, the Order of Preachers.
Who was this man who had come by canoe to revive the protective embrace of the church? Although he's referred to as an Italian, there was no Italy when Samuel Mazzucchelli was born in 1806. His birthplace, Milan, was the capital city of a province ruled by Napoleon Bonaparte. Samuel came into the world literally in the shadow of the soaring spires of the Duomo, Milan's famous cathedral. Samuel's mother, Rachele, died suddenly after his 6th birthday, and he was sent to the Collegio di Sant'Antonio, a boarding school in Lugano, Switzerland. Returning home 11 years later, Samuel informed his family that he intended to become a Dominican.
So and I hope folks appreciate how wonderfully it's shot. You can see that it's very rich photography, and you get a sense of what these missionaries did. Now, we just have a few minutes, but I want to take a quick look at Father Kraft, because he was involved even in the very famous Battle of Wounded Knee.
Yeah. Father Kraft was 10 years old, and he was in the Battle of Gettysburg in the Civil War at the age of 10, was given a letter by his father to allow him to participate in a battle at the age of 10. He got wounded. He went off and fought in the Franco-Prussian War in the Battle of Sedan and was
1870?
wounded. Yeah, 1870s. So he's already he was born in 1852, so he's still only 20. And then following that, he was involved in the Cuban-American conflict, which would have been a little bit later. And then he decides he wants to be a priest. So he starts with the Jesuits, and they decided that wasn't a good fit. This man's temperament was not the type of temperament to take orders from superiors, and that was a hallmark his entire life. He chafed against those above him, although he made important allies with those above him he was always one step ahead of everybody else. But Kraft then became a priest. He was sent to the Dakota Territory and began his work there with the Lakota Sioux in the various agencies or reservations that were set up there. Yeah, he had conflict in the first one. Well, I don't know how much.
Well, we don't have too much time, but it is worth noting that he had gone to Wounded Knee to try to bring peace between the Lakota people and the government soldiers.
This we're up to 1890 now, but yes, he tried to intercede in the two factions that were. The Indians were fed up. I mean, they were starving. They had nothing. It was winter. It was bad.
Yeah.
And they had guns under their robes, and the soldiers were. He was trying to separate people, and it just all hell broke loose.
Yeah. He got wounded himself.
He got stabbed. Probably by an Indian, but because I think the story goes he was trying to, an Indian stabbed him by mistake. He was trying to help him because Kraft was really one of them.
Yeah, when you get into a fight, you know, things get out of control.
Yeah.
And it's you know, because famously in that battle, people are shooting folks on their own side.
Exactly.
And so, and it happened to both sides. But he had tried to work peace, and because he survived the battle, he was able to report what he actually saw.
Yes. Interestingly, he, being a military man at heart, he said that the soldiers had done everything they could to prevent what happened. But when he was lying in his deathbed and he thought he was going to die, he said he wanted to be buried with the Indians. See, so there he is in that interstitial area between those two cultures, belonging to both and trying to bring light into that darkness that existed.
Yeah, this, you know, the story of the interaction is one of a materially superior culture. By material superior, I mean having better metals, weapons, technology that was, you know, more advanced when it came especially to things like war and industry. And in that kind of a situation, the weaker culture oftentimes is abused. Right. That's just the sad history of humanity for a long, long time in most places. And, you know, this is where it's good for us to read about and know about. Matter of fact, I would urge people to read books like 1491 that tells the story that we can figure out of Native Americans from North and South America to get a feel for these very distinct and very interesting cultures, but they didn't have the technology of the old world. And then it doesn't talk about that conflict, but for us to know that too. And that's why I think this is an important thing to see the role of the church in trying to bring peace and a just way of interacting. We have to take a break. We're going to come back in a couple of minutes. We want to get some of your comments and questions, as well as those from our studio audience. Please stay with us. So just want to again announce to you that this video called Faith on the Frontier about these three missionaries is going to be on tonight at 10 p.m. Eastern Time. It'll be repeated on Thursday at 10 a.m. Eastern Time on EWTN. You can also see it on EWTN.com, so that you can, I'm sure we'll eventually have it on Facebook and all that, because we want to get that available for you to take a look at and see some of the great things that happened with these early missionaries. Start off with a question from our studio audience. Ma'am, where are you from?
I'm from Oklahoma City.
So now that's a very important state for Native Americans because many of them were forced into the Oklahoma Territory.
Absolutely.
Before it was a state.
Absolutely.
So what's your question or comment?
Well, we had the pleasure of having missionaries in our state, for instance, Catherine Drexel. I was just wondering, back in the early days, if there were religious orders in the United States established that were willing to send missionaries out to the far reaches.
Yeah.
Well, yes, certainly. You're talking about Catholic orders, right?
Yes, I
You know, some more than others. We've mentioned the Jesuits, of course. They're probably the predominant ones. In the Lakota, Dakota area, it would be the Benedictines. The Benedictine order, Swiss Benedictines, dominated the missionary work in that particular area. Bishop Martin Marty, who was Kraft's bishop, who ordained Kraft, he was a Dominican.
Yes. And again, people like Mother Drexel, St. Mother Drexel, she was from, I think it was the Drexels were the wealthiest family in Philadelphia.
She founded her own order.
Yeah, and you know, she used up her family's wealth. You know, after her parents had died and she was in charge, and they used it for missions among African Americans and Native American people. That was a special focus. And let's see, Mother Elizabeth Ann Seton also was had a lot for the Native Americans. There were a lot of folks that had concern. You know, sometimes we think of Americans having this monolithic attitude of just getting rid of the Indians. People were very mixed. It was like the slavery issue. Some people said this isn't right, and they knew it wasn't right, and they wanted to be there to help these folks.
If you start even with the founding of the country, even before the revolution, the U.S. government was formulating policies with respect to Native Americans from the get-go. Thomas Jefferson's writing on what he saw as the future of Native Americans in this country it's an amazing document to read. Also rather sad because most of what he predicted and hoped would happen did not happen. But they felt strongly that they wanted to assimilate and integrate with these folks. Now, 19th century or early 19th century Jefferson, turn of the 19th, 18th, 19th, the mentality is, of course, not the mentality that we would consider appropriate or the best one. We considered ourselves to be superior. I mean, because of our technology, because of our medicine, because of all the things we had, and we would probably not see it that way quite today. Although I don't know what outcome really, given the extreme clash that was bound to the extreme difference in cultural attitudes, I'm not sure how else it could have worked out.
Yeah, I'm not. It really was a major clash because, on one hand, while the European folks had these superior cultural items and tools, like hard metals, iron, steel. Nobody had done that. Draft animals,
wheels.
the wheels. And with wheels come the ideas about gears and machines that are very complicated. And Native Americans were not apparently looking for most of that kind of more sedentary culture. Those depend on sedentary society that didn't fit all groups. Some groups were farmers and sedentary, and some groups were migratory. And they liked what they did. There's a lot of peace and happiness with various aspects of their different cultures. So how do you deal with that? Because
it's very complex.
It was.
Especially when you get into diseases and unintended consequences of bringing European diseases into the region, which was devastating.
The Native Americans had no resistance to smallpox. Smallpox is a disease that started with North African gerbils. And it affected people in that interaction with the gerbils and devastated Europe. But some resistance developed, same with influenza. But there had never been smallpox.
The one item that
and
I
there had never
read
been
over and over
influenza.
again in the accounts of these missionaries, that the most nefarious element that was brought in by us was alcohol.
Yes, yes, and that's the other thing.
They mentioned it over, de Smet mentions it over and over again.
And there's a lack, there are enzymes that are not present in Native American physical build that processes alcohol. And so it's something that is just immediately poisonous. Immediately poisonous. Of course it is. Of course it is. And this is one of the real problems that is still devastating the Native American population. Father de Smet, had contact with these different types of cultures. Some who were farmers and others who were nomadic, traveling around, especially after the introduction of the horse. And he saw that this was not easy to evangelize the nomadic folks.
Exactly. The missionaries always wanted to contact the populations that were more sedentary because they'd stay in one place and they could be taught. His idea was to get beyond the interface of the two cultures out to the far west, where the Native Americans were still in a more or less pristine, for them, state, and create a Christian utopia. That's what he was trying to do out there. In St. Mary's, in St. Ignatius, in all the missions that the Jesuits founded out there, that was their goal, to get beyond the clash that was occurring. And he was ultimately frustrated, he was ultimately disappointed in the results, but it was a valiant effort.
Well, one of the things he liked when the European folks weren't close by, that they would oftentimes bring things like alcohol as a tool to trade and control Native American populations, and for their own purposes, not to help the Native Americans. So that was very much a problem. And a couple of other things too with the folks that were up in, I guess, the Upper Peninsula, of Michigan, the Ojibwe people. Again, that's a very distinctive kind of culture. Each one of these cultures was very much part of its environment and adapted to its environment, just like in Europe and the old world.
Climate and the way the transportation, waterways, if they had them, if they didn't have them, just a patchwork that they were working in. And what comes through when you read about them, though, is how tireless they were and how they just never gave up. They were programmed. They just never gave up.
That
died in the traces.
But that element of not giving up is not about a human optimism. This is something that comes from Christian hope, which is a gift from God. That's a grace to have hope that the salvation of these individuals, not seeking something from them, as you mentioned earlier. They're not trying to take stuff from the culture. They have hope that God will be able to touch their souls to the very depth and you keep working with that hope in view. And that's a very important understanding of what motivates one of these missionaries.
I don't know, maybe there are people in the audience who know horses really well. One story that I thought was amazing, when Mazzucchelli got to Cincinnati, he wasn't there a year. There was one night a knock came at the door of the rectory, and Father O'Leary answered, and there was someone requesting a priest for someone who was dying 90 miles away, and it's a thunderstorm in the middle of the night. And he got on a horse and and left.
Yeah. You know, that's...
Can a horse make it 90 miles in one day? In 24 hours? Does anybody know? I kind of looked, I thought 90, I don't know about 90.
I don't think 90.
I don't know.
That's
a ride.
That'd be a lot,
That'd be a lot
especially if it's in a storm.
Maybe, maybe it was 9.
Yeah.
That more like it?
Wait a minute, you got to get that story straight.
Well, it's just in print. I can't.
Yeah, 9 miles he could do, but not 90.
He wrote 90.
Yeah, but it's you know, it points that kind of request in prompt response points out that this is what we need to seek from the young men who are called to the priesthood, and evoke, you know, that there needs to be this kind of selflessness. That's why Vatican II is very strong on the role of celibacy. You know, in the document on priesthood, the role of celibacy is seen as a great gift that is meant to have you be strong for the sake of serving selflessly. You know, you don't second guess, you just go out there and do it. And this is a very important expectation that should be had for priests and for the young men who are studying toward the priesthood. It's not meant to be an easy life. You know, that's a very important element of this, because these guys were tough. You know, the kind of journeys they made. You bring out, for instance, in the video, Father de Smet was very sick with malaria on his way out the first time he went.
I think it was malaria. I would have suspected maybe cholera too, because St. Louis was afflicted with that many times. Sure. I don't know, but they said malaria, but he was flat out. I don't think he saw anything of the trip except the clouds. Yeah. But he made it, and then they'd stop. He was accompanying a group of trappers who were going to an annual rendezvous, a trappers' rendezvous, and those were kind of like, if you can imagine, you going to the festival they have up near Reno. What's it called? Burning Man. So if you go to Burning Man and try to preach, I mean, this is what he was faced with at these rendezvous, where there were fights and alcohol and people biting each other's noses off and all this stuff. And here he finds himself in the middle of that.
That's what they do in Reno? They bite their noses off?
I'm trying to make a parallel.
Oh, okay.
You know, I've never been to Burning Man, so I don't know what they do. I see the pictures, you know, but I'm just saying. It would be a tough. It would be a tough row for you there. I think, right?
Yeah. Well, it's you know, I remember there was a convention, a cable convention in Las Vegas some years ago, and I went, and I don't gamble, you know, and I don't go to the shows and all this. So, you know, I said, okay, but we got work to do. But then I discovered that finding sinners was like shooting fish in a barrel. I mean, this is what, you know, this is something
you had
that.
Your pick.
It was, I mean, you know, when a guy starts talking about how am I going to tell my wife I lost $45,000 tonight? Well, let's sit this through and figure this out. You know, you got a lot of issues with, so it was good. But if they're in the midst, if they're drunk and they're fighting, you can't evangelize.
Yeah, I don't know how they got through that.
Yeah.
But they did.
But you work through it. You wait till they sober up. And as a priest in those, you know, I've certainly been working with gangs, and what you have to do is wait till the fight's over and deal with it afterwards. But you just have to stay back away from it, because there's nothing you can do when they're in the frenzy. This is something that's very much has to be done otherwise. And I think, you know, to see when I look at these men that you describe here, it's interesting to me to see them as a model I would like Catholics. We're living at a time when heroes are constantly attacked and denigrated. And we want to take down their statues, and we want to, you know, reject was courageous, but I don't like the cause, and they were bad. They had bad motives, and we have to reject them. And instead of understanding people in their own time, see their flaws. They're human beings. They're sinners, and they did bad things and sometimes evil things, and yet could also do heroic things.
It might be a good idea to put up statues instead of taking them down. Put up statues of the things that you find valuable.
Very much so.
Yeah.
And this is where, I know in New York they're trying to bring more statues of women, heroic women. Mm-hmm. And I thought, we already do that in the Catholic Church. There's no Catholic Church in New York without statues and stained glass images of heroic women. Mm-hmm. Starting with Our Lady. Mm-hmm. And we need those heroes of faith. Mm-hmm. And I think that's what I like about what you've done, is that you've presented heroes of faith who respected Native American and cherished Native American culture and their people. At the same time, tried to make a bridge to the oncoming European culture. And they gave their whole lives for that. That's what makes them heroic. Willing to give up everything they knew of comfort with language, family, what was an easier way of life in the cities like St. Louis and Cincinnati. They went out and just did heroic stuff at their own risk. Again, want to remind you that this is called Faith on the Frontier. It's going to be on tonight for the first time at 10 p.m. Eastern Time. It'll be repeated on Thursday at 10 a.m. Eastern Time, all here on EWTN. And you can also check into it at EWTN.com. This kind of work you're doing is one of the things that we try to do in bringing lots of stories of the saints to give us heroic characters. So I thank you very much for being here with us.
Appreciate the opportunity.
Thank you for being with us tonight to join us in this and prepare for this video. We pray, Lord, bless you and keep you all as strong as these great missionaries of the past in spreading our faith and in sharing the goodness of God. May God bless you, the Father, the Son, and the Holy Spirit. And so that we can continue bringing you these programs, please keep us in between your gas bill, electric bill, and cable bill. And we'll pay the bills to get more of these videos. Thank you. God bless.